Okay, so here's an eating spoon, and I'm going to be doing the finishing cuts. Hi, Jerry. I had it in a plastic bag because it doesn't have much moisture left. Now, interestingly, this has a little wormhole here. And so one of the main things I'm going to be trying to do is to get under that wormhole. It's worth noting that when I do blanks for other people, not only will stay finishing up your lunch if you address anything that has to do with your questions. Yes, absolutely, Jerry. And if I'll give some thought to your questions and also answer on the VAC thread as well. So one thing to note is that because I couldn't drop this down further, this has sort of a much more sinuous line. And it's also worth noting that when I do blanks for other people, I would never have given somebody a blank with a wormhole that close to the handle. So this is part of the Virtual Apprenticeship Challenge. Oh, my knives are still out. Stand by. Sorry, I was taking a photo comparing the sizes of the different knives for somebody. For Jerry, in fact. So because this is part of the Virtual Apprenticeship Challenge, this week is about finishing cuts. So I'm starting at this stage, and we're going to be talking about chamfers, bowl hollowing, and micro chamfers particularly. If anyone has questions, you don't have to be part of the Virtual Apprenticeship Challenge to ask questions or watch this at all. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable about that. I'm just letting you know that that's why I'm going to be talking about what I'm going to be talking about. One other thing to note. So this is, are wormholes an issue on final products? If so, how do I address them? I try not to have any wormholes ever on final products. So I was pretty confident that I was going to be able to wiggle around this one, which is why I kept going with the spoon. But if it had been something that I definitely wouldn't have been able to get rid of, I would have just abandoned the spoon at that point. So this one is tangentially oriented, which means that it's going to have the concentric rings in the bowl. And it's worth pointing out that when you do it this way, particularly on low moisture content woods, like this cherry, it is a little more brittle when you're carving the outline. It has more of a tendency to tear out when it's oriented this way than when it's oriented the other way. And that has to do with how the cells are connected to one another. Suffice to say, when you are carving a spoon that has this orientation, where you're expecting to have the concentric rings in the center of the bowl, be careful when you're carving this outline, especially when you're doing your final carving, because it is going to be less forgiving than if it was radially oriented. It just is. So another thing to point out, and this is something that I mentioned on the VAC, where I was just talking to them, is that, and it's worth pointing out, guys, the April VAC is filling up. I am going to have enough people doing it for it to happen. If you'd like to jump on board, it's starting April 8th. It's $50. It's a month-long thing. There's all this content. There's all this conversation that happens within it. So if that's something you're interested in, challenging yourself with, just send me a message. And in terms of time commitment, it's completely up to you how much time you commit to it. I'm not requiring anything of anybody. It's more just I'm making this available, and you can sort of make of it what you want to make of it. So don't feel like, I don't have the time commitment to do what Emmett says you should do, because really that varies dramatically from person to person. So you got to be careful when you're in this orientation. I would say there's also an important distinction to be made between cuts up until this point, which are much more bold and aggressive, and at this point where when I carve the outline, I'm going to be much more into making delicate small cuts. But just because you see me do delicate small cuts here doesn't mean that's how I do it for the entire spoon. It'll take you way longer to carve a spoon if you do delicate small cuts the entire time. So, because this wormhole is the thing that might make this not work out, I'm going to deal with it first. I'm going to do chamfers on the back of the handle and see if I can get down underneath it. And then that way, if I need to pull the chamfer up pretty far in order to eliminate it, then I know how far I have to go before I do any chamfers on the top of the handle. So always dive at the thing that might ruin the spoon first, so that you don't waste a bunch of time only to get to it and realize that it was never going to work out anyways. So, okay, I'm gently trying. I want to basically get just underneath this, but no more, because I don't really have much more room. So look at how I'm making these cuts. I've got my thumb right here on the middle. Normally, if I'm making boulder cuts, my thumb is down here like this. But now I've got my thumb up here to help stabilize, because I'm making these cuts not really with the tip of the knife, more with sort of here next to my thumb. So the thumb, I'm not making it right underneath my thumb. I'm making it maybe a ½ inch beyond my thumb. And that thumb is really helping me stabilize. I guess here I am using the tip of the knife, but that thumb is helping me stabilize these cuts. And then notice how I go from bracing this against my chest and pulling down towards myself, and then when this hand hits my body, I then switch and keep this braced and pull the spoon out like that. And that allows me to get much smoother, continuous cuts than I otherwise would. Hi Daniel, hi Sherry. Okay, so I'm getting underneath. There we go. Now I've eliminated that wormhole, right? It's not there anymore, and I know exactly how much I have to work with and how much I can remove on the other side. So again, I've got my thumb braced halfway up the blade. I'm paying attention to the facet on the side. I'm sorry, I know this is a little bit washed out, so you can't actually see the facets, but we'll play with camera placement in a little bit here when I get around to doing the bowl. And you also want to make sure you remove any wood chips or shavings from the blade, because they can mess up your cut when you're first starting if you have a shaving on your blade. And what I like to do is use a series of facets. It's not a great example because that's a little too high. Use a series of facets to create a rounded form, so that, there we go. So you can see I've used a series of loose facets. Now you could do more finicky facets. The nice thing about loose facets like this is that you can adjust them to get the overall form exactly how you want, without having it look imprecise because one facet is slightly bigger than the other, because they're all bigger than, they're not all the same size. Whereas if you shoot for something that's really sort of perfectly symmetrical, then if something goes awry, you're sort of sent scrambling. Can I darken the window behind me? Oh, yeah, that would be a good thing. Hold on. Stand by. Maybe yes. Let's also try, here, I'm going to try one other thing. I'm going to try bringing this up higher, closer to me. And let's maybe bring it even higher still. Angle it down. There we go. I think this might be better. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So now I've got the back of the handle done. And the nice thing about doing the back of the handle is that you can adjust what you want to have on the top of the handle to the reality of how you needed to make the back of the handle. So in this instance, I did the back of the handle first because of that wormhole, but I almost always do the back of the handle anyways. I think because, at least with eating spoons, it's sort of what these two fingers come up against. So I want to make it feel exactly right. Now, depending on how thin this is, you can get away with this being flat, but if your handle is quite fat, you're going to want to have there be, is that any better? Hold on, I'm gonna try rotating my entire chair here. Stand by. That might be even better still. So if your handle is very flat, you can get away with having minimal chamfers on the corners. If your handle is quite thick, it should have some sort of sloping angle because your thumb actually is coming in at an angle. You can see how your thumb, for a spoon, how do I describe it, comes in at this angle, right? And you can get away with it wrapping over it to be like this if it's quite thin. But if it's fatter, it just feels weird to have your thumb come in like this, and it feels much better to have it come in at an angle like this. In this instance, it's basically flat. So I'm going to do a chamfer on this side, paying attention to how much edge I'm leaving here. I don't want to exceed the edge that I have here. I want to maintain a little bit of edge, and that keeps it looking the same from this angle. Now, right down here is the grain change, down here at the neck. And so I either want to leave it attached or just break it off for the moment, and we'll get there and do it once. You want to trim up that neck just once you cut all your chamfers, because if you do it with each chamfer, let's say you're doing, so I'm going to do 3 chamfers. So let's say you're doing 1 and then a micro chamfer on either side, 2, 3. If I tried to clean up the neck for each one of those individually, chances are I would mess up one or the other of them and start digging that neck deeper and deeper and deeper. So by waiting and just doing it once, I essentially minimize the chance that I'm going to go too far. Okay, so now I have this connection here at the neck. That's still not great. How do I... There we go. So now I have this connection here at the neck, and I want to make sure that it's happening right down at the actual point where it changes direction there, because if I try to do it further up, it's going to be much harder for my knife. So you can see this part right here needs to be pushed down to that deepest part of the neck, just there. And that's going to be much, much easier to clean up now that it's down there in the actual neck of the spoon there. So then I come in with just the tip and just with almost like a scraping motion. And I want to sort of approach it and get underneath it. I don't want to attack right at it. Now sometimes you still end up with a little spot. Going to show me. Here we go. You see right next to this finger that little spot where it didn't want to totally clean up. So then you come in from the other direction and just whoop. Good. That's good enough, right? That's going to be just about how it's going to be at the end. I'm just taking a moment to just knock off any little bumps that I see here on the outside, because now, let's see, I'm going to do just a smidge more down here in the neck. It's possible to get stuck down in here in the neck and go back and forth and have it be a real pain. But you can see how when I did these micro chamfers on the neck, again, I'm using the sort of the tip or slightly down from the tip of the knife. My thumb is halfway up the blade, and I'm just taking these tiny little shavings. I'm just letting the edge rest right on it. if your knife blade can't do this, it's a sign that you need to stop and sharpen, particularly paying attention to the tip of the knife. And if your knife in general is having a hard time making these delicate cuts, it could be a sign, if you are sure that your knife edge is sharp, it could be a sign that your bevel is slightly convexed. The sloyd bevel of the knife is slightly convexed, and as you're trying to go really shallow, that rounded part of the bevel is actually bumping the edge up out of the wood. So I also take a moment and trim the end of the handle. I'm basically trying to do everything that the handle needs, except for this little bit back here at the keel, which is going to be adjusted once I carve the back of the bowl for the final time. Yeah, Chuck, this is the new long knife. I'm trying to do everything the handle needs, almost as a psychological ploy, so that I don't go back to it. Because I've ruined spoons by waiting to do the handle till last, and there's always something you can do. And so I like to create sort of hard stopping points where I get something to what I consider to be a final place, and then I walk away from it and I'm done no matter what. And it just helps me psychologically both be efficient with my time, but also keeps me from dithering back and forth on something until I've ruined something that was good by trying to make it perfect. What time is it over here? It's 1 o'clock. Daniel, is it like, what are we, 8 hours apart? So it's like 9 o'clock for you? Yeah, this is the new knife from Matt. This is a 4-inch Sloyd, so it's long. I think it has the same angle as the Pro Grind, and the handle isn't really any bigger. And I really like the extra length. But I will also say that the jury's still out. You know, I have this knife as part of a testing program where we're going to have me test it for a while before I start recommending it to people. Initial signs are good that I like it, but you know, who knows? I might have a more nuanced response in a couple months after using it. So don't all go galumphing over to Matt and say, oh, I want the 4-inch Sloyd just because you see me using it. The whole point of having me test knives is that we learn something about it that helps make the knives better. It's only 6 hours difference? That's crazy. Okay, so I'm also just doing little micro chamfers on the chamfers on the back so that when you feel the spoon all over, I personally want a spoon that doesn't have sharp edges. I want distinguishable facets, but I don't want sharp edges. So since that's what I want, this is the moment to get it. So when you're at this stage also, it's really easy. If you mess around with the neck too much, it's really easy to essentially make the bowl look lopsided just by shaving off a tiny bit here or a tiny bit here. It'll skew which way the bowl feels like it's tipping. And so just be really cautious at this stage. I would try and avoid messing around with the neck at all because it has outsized effects on the apparent symmetry of the whole thing. All right, so now I'm going to carve the bowl of the spoon because I've got the handle exactly how I want it. I eliminated that wormhole that was on the back. I've got my chamfers. I've done the back of the handle. Everything is good to go. I'm going to carve the bowl. So the first thing I do when I carve the bowl, well, first of all, let's talk about how I use the hook knife. I am the sort of person who always carves the hook with the hook knife like this in my hand. And what you can see is that actually this forefinger is actually wrapped around the edge of the spine of the blade itself like that. I am not down like this because if I'm down like this, I actually both have much less power and I'm much more likely to cut my thumb. You see when I'm totally choked up, you see how close to my thumb I am? Whereas if I'm down here, you see how in bringing it down, it allows it to go further out. And then when it comes in, you see how much further away from my hand I am. That extra 1/4 inch can mean the difference between, that's more than 1/4 inch, it's a 1/2 inch or so. That can mean the difference between cutting your thumb or not cutting your thumb. It also gives me much more power to be holding the hook like this. So it's square across my fingers. This finger right here is on the spine here. You can actually see that I have a very large callus right where that is. And then these fingers wrap around, and I'm going to use it like this. So I support the spoon bowl against my palm the entire time. So it's either held like this or it's held like this. Occasionally I hold it like this, but it's always supported in my palm. You're never going to see me hold it like this because you can snap the neck of the spoon like that. It's also easy when you're holding it like this to mistakenly think that just going down like this is going downhill in the grain. But you need to remember the bowl is actually tilted up in the grain. So downhill in the grain is actually from the tip down to this deepest part. There is a point here, right up at the top, where down is actually going down into here. But if you want to carve the bowl, it either needs to be coming vaguely in this direction or it needs to be going straight across like that. You cannot carve down this way because it'll just snag. Now, somebody at the Spoonosaurus gathering gave a great example of how to think about grain. He said it's like petting a dog. When you're petting a dog and you're petting it with the fur the right way, it just feels smooth and easy. You know immediately when you're petting it the wrong way because it feels rough and it just is not as pleasant. So you should be feeling with your knife. If you're going with the grain, it should feel like petting a dog. And if you're going the wrong direction in the grain, the knife is going to chatter, it's going to stop, it's going to get stuck. And you're petting the dog the wrong direction. The reason it works to carve across the bowl is that you're diving down into the grain this way and essentially coming up out of that cut, and the knife can, because it's fairly shallow, the knife can exit up out of that cut for the most part. It's always easier to start carving the bowl from the center and work your way out, like digging a hole with a shovel. You don't start by defining a perimeter and digging in from the perimeter until you have this giant lump of soil in the middle that you still need to remove. In the same way, it would be a real pain in the neck if you started out at the edges and cut your way around the edges and then had this big lump of wood in the middle. It's much easier to start in the middle. And the only reason I'm going down in a line is that it's not a perfect circle. If this was a scoop that was round, I would just do one in the middle and then start immediately circling my way around and around. Because this is oblong, I'm doing sort of a trench, if you were, and then I'm going to start widening the trench going around. Notice how when I was making those cuts, my thumb was always braced on the opposite side of the spoon bowl so that I'm pulling towards my thumb. The thing I don't like about these cuts is that where's the power coming from? The power is coming from pressing down with these fingers. It's not nearly as much power as this. Here, I feel like I can really apply force, and while it looks like I'm getting close to my thumb, you can see that, first of all, I'm not actually that close to my thumb, and second of all, this is as tight as my fist will ever be, so I can't actually hit my thumb. So it's actually much safer, to my mind, to have a situation where I can't actually hit my thumb. You will also notice that I am definitely not trying to exit up and over my thumb. I really don't like that teaching technique, and I think it's a way to really gouge a big chunk out of the side of your thumb. So don't. If it wants to stop down in here and then you just sort of pop it free, you see how it stopped, popped it free, and then you turn it around to get this side rather than exit up and over your thumb, do that. Don't exit up and over your thumb. Just have it go to being closed and be done. Now, you'll notice that I turn it around and can come at it from this angle. Sometimes it's braced against my chest, sometimes it's not, depending, but it's always supported in my hand like this. And so now I'm starting to nibble my way out as I go deeper. Just like, let's go back to that shovel analogy, just like how when you're digging a hole with a shovel and you start essentially grabbing soil from the edge of the hole and making the hole wider so that you can go deeper, that's exactly what you're doing with the hook knife. And I'm just spinning it around so I can get from the outside edges down into the deepest part, and that's going with the grain. Okay, that's all I'm doing at this stage. I'm just grabbing from the outside edge and going down into the middle. And I'm trying to do it evenly all the way around so that I don't end up with one area that's really delicate and one area that still requires a lot of force to hollow. Sometimes, a lot of the times, I'm essentially pivoting on the tip of the knife and using the back half of the knife. That's not to say I'm using this part of the knife, but you can see how the motion is sort of pivoting on the tip. You see that? How that sort of motion is pivoting on the tip? Other times, I'm essentially pivoting on this part of the blade and pivoting the tip around, which I think people understand also maybe a little bit better. But you can see how I'm still bracing with this thumb on the opposite side. So I'm pulling towards that thumb as I'm cutting around with the tip like that. Does that make sense, guys? Anyone have any questions so far? All right, now that I have gotten this far, I'm going to stop for a second. This is the perfect time. I'm going to put the sheath on the knife. This is the perfect moment to trim the rim here. Because when you look at the rim from the side, you can see how that rim sticks up from there up to there. As he drops the spoon. You can see how the rim is angled out. And that's because there used to be a lot of material in here. And so when I was cutting the rim, I was doing it at an angle to avoid that. Well, now that that material in the middle is gone, this is the perfect moment to retrim the lip of the bowl, the rim of the bowl, and have it be flat. And that will just make for a much more refined looking rim. So again, same cuts as we're doing that before. A pivot cut where I'm essentially pivoting the blade. Sometimes I do it with my hand here. In this instance, I'm backing off and pivoting the blade on these fingers here. And I'm pivoting the blade around. Now you notice that I'm moving these fingers as well. So I'm sort of moving where the pivot is. But make no mistake, it's a pivot cut, which allows me to stop on a dime because there's no force pulling it towards myself. And I'm trying to make it roughly as flat as I can, which usually means pushing down the inner side, but leaving the outer side basically how it is. And you can see how that makes for, let's see if I can get it. Well, hold on. First of all, I gotta do a good job of it, and then I'll show it to you. There we go. So you can see how that makes for a nice smooth line there. I'm actually gonna push it down a little bit more. I have whatever depth I have in this rim, that's the amount of wiggle room I have to mess with the curvature here. And there we go. I like that quite a bit. And now I'm going to carve this side of the rim. And again, I'm focusing on pressing down the inner side and almost not touching the outer side. And that's how I get it flat. I mess with the outer side in so much as I want to actually change the way the curve looks. But I try and hold the knife so that it's essentially flat. And I'm paying attention to how it looks from this angle here. And what I want to avoid is having too much of a sort of steep lead up to the tip here. So, going along like that. Now again, you're going to hit a grain change right here at the rim. And from there, for that, you got to come down from the other direction like this. Good. 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 I look at it from the back. Look at it from the front. I can see that I still have a bit of a lump here, so I'm going to adjust that a little bit. Spoon carving is all about looking. It's about being able to look at it from different angles, which thankfully is something that everybody can do, and see, oh yeah, I've got still a little bit of a lump here. Here's what I need to do to remove that. Don't do too much. And once you can have the habit of turning and turning and turning it so that you're looking at it from all angles, it just gets a lot easier. The knot in the middle of the bowl. Is that of concern to me? No, not really. It's not really a knot. It's more of a grit cell that cherry has sometimes. And I can see from the outside that it's not really there. Yeah, it's definitely not a knot, or if it is, it's so tiny it's going to be gone in just a second here. So, now that I have the rim of the bowl the way I want it. Yes, yes. Now that I have the rim of the bowl the way I want it, now is my chance to go back with the hook knife and establish the inner rim exactly how I want it. So I've locked in this variable from this side, and now I'm going to lock in this variable from this side. The reason I do the inner rim before I do the rest of the bowl hollowing is that if I try and establish that inner rim as part of hollowing the bowl, it's just going to be a lot harder to get it exactly the way I want it. It's so easy to get it the way I want it when all I'm doing with the cut is trying to do just that one thing, just get the rim exactly how I want it. And I'm not worried about how it's coming up out of the bowl or anything like that. It's about creating the line that your eye sees, because your eye sees that point of contrast between the rim and here. It doesn't see what the curvature of it is. It just sees that there is a contrast. So I'm just making this cut by itself, and I'll spend some time fussing with this to really get it exactly how I want it. And I have found that it is much easier to make a rim look good if you're not trying to have it be equal thickness all the way around. And in fact, that's something that also feels better in your mouth, because it feels better to have this rim on the sides here and here for an eating spoon be really thin. Because if it's fat, you feel it in here and here in your lip as you pull it out of your mouth. At the same time, it's not helpful to have the tip of the bowl be that thin, because the tip of the bowl is what strikes against stuff. And if you make it that thin, the spoon won't be nearly as durable. So that goes nicely hand in hand with the fact that if you are going to have the rim be unequal sizes and narrower on the sides and thicker at the tip, it's really easy to make that look good, because all you're doing is adjusting this line until it looks like it's got a nice, sweet, even curve as it goes around, not an even thickness. So you can see I'm just going around, essentially getting that line of the rim exactly how I want it. Good. If I was trying to do this while also doing something with the actual bowl itself, the depth of the bowl itself, this would be way harder and take a lot more time and be more fraught with risk. Here, so you can see it wasn't actually a knot. It's more of one of these grit cells coming through. So here I am. I'm getting the rim exactly how I want it. In this one corner of the spoon bowl, you're going to find it easier to actually go straight down in with your hook knife and use the curvature of the hook knife to establish the curve that you need. Kind of overlapping strokes to get it exactly how you want it. Like that. Whereas in other places, you're going to find that actually sweeping the hook knife around from different orientations is going to work better. I don't recommend that pressing in straight from the rim for everywhere. It's just that one spot. It's hard to do otherwise. So, good. Like that. I've almost got the rim the way I want it. Okay. I would say one area that's easy to undercut and leave the rim a little too thick is right here and right here. It's easy to leave that be too thick. Hi, Tucker. So just watch that. So, good. All right, now you can see, I don't know if you can see, but it's slightly fatter here, slightly thinner here, and somewhere in between down here. Nice. See you, Tom. Tom, you need to get a new phone, man. I feel like you're always on the edge of your phone battery dying. All right, so now that I have the rim exactly how I want it, I am going to concentrate on getting a nice curvature throughout the entire belly of the bowl. And that's going to happen from a series of cuts. So first of all, I'm just going to, any high spots, I'm going to sort of roughly get underneath. And once I get it to more of closer to the curve that I want, I'm going to go to a series of blending cuts. But you'll also see that I'm staying away from that rim. You see how far I'm staying away from that rim? And I'll ease my way up to it. So here we go. And you can see how these cuts are now easier now that I've gotten below that sort of choppy bit. And I'm waiting to get up close to the rim until I get closer to a nice curve, and then I will ease up to it once it's, because you just have much more control. So now I have pretty close to the curvature that I want. And now I'm going to essentially take off the cuts that ease the belly of the bowl up to that rim itself. And I'm going to blend from there down into the center of the bowl. Now sometimes I can come out just like that. Sometimes if I'm coming down and I feel like I'm going to get stuck, I can exit out by pivoting the whole thing like that. And that just pivots the hook knife across the cut that it was making. And it makes it relatively easy to get out of these cuts so that you pivot. You can use that same pivoting technique to pivot across the back of the bowl itself. Like that. And that gets you a lot of the bowl. There's still this one little area here that's needs a little more help, but you can see how by following those steps of establishing the rim and then sort of getting the choppiness down to so where it's not as choppy, and then blending up to the rim, and then from there blending down into the center of the bowl, it's very few steps and very fast to get down to exactly where I want, and to end up with a spoon bowl with almost no visible marks on it. Now there's this one quadrant where it's always really tricky not to have visible marks on it. So you get kind of ghost into it from both directions. Sometimes come at it from here. Good. Now, when I think I'm close, put it in my mouth and see, because you can't tell unless you put it in your mouth if you have really done enough. And in this case, I actually have almost got it exactly right. Let's do a little more tidying up. One spot that I have done enough on, but where I often see people not doing quite enough, is right here in the center of the bowl. I think because it's kind of an awkward cut to come down like this, and again, see that my thumb is braced here. It's slightly awkward cut, but it's really important when you pull it out of your mouth. If you haven't done enough there, you'll really feel it on your top lip. So, good. So I do enough until I feel like the feel on the inside is exactly how I want it. And then I'm going to make the outside adjust to it. So don't worry about whether the bowl is too thick. Don't make the bowl the right thickness from doing the inside. Make the bowl the right thickness from then making the outside react to it. How do you avoid chasing grain at the bottom of the bowl? Yeah, so that's where going down, and then if you're having trouble exiting out like this, you do the pivot like this. So by pivoting the spoon, and essentially, I mean, you could look at it as pivoting the knife, but it's easier to hold the knife still and actually pivot the spoon. And then the knife essentially goes from making a cut with the grain to then pivoting around and cutting across the grain just for that last little end of the cut there. That's a really crucial bit. So now I'm going to do a little tiny micro chamfer right here with the hook knife. There's no point in switching to the Sloyd for this. The hook knife is perfect for this sort of thing. And what I'm doing is just essentially scraping off that sharp little edge that's formed from the inside of the bowl coming up to the rim. So again, I'm making this cut following the grain. So that means I go down to where the grain changes, and then I turn around and I come at it from the other direction. There's always a spot here and here where the grain changes, and you have to sort of meet it from either side. You just be gentle. That'll work the best. Okay, now that I have the bowl the way I want it, now is my chance to look at the outside and decide if I need to do any last minute little trimming up. Once you have cut the inner rim with the hook knife, that inner rim will be a sweeter curve usually than what you could achieve with the straight knife on the outside. So once you have that sweet line, it's possible to decide to adjust the outside to make it match it a little bit better. It doesn't have to like match it, like be perfectly parallel to it, but just match it in that where you have bumps will become more evident once you have that inner rim cut. And I don't advocate going back and completely recarving. I do advocate going back and just trying to remove just the tiniest little bit of those bumps so that it looks smoother. You don't have to get it perfect for it to make a big difference in how smooth the whole thing looks. And you can see I'm just taking off a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, a little bit there. Now, once I have that, now it's time to do the chamfer, the micro chamfer that is going to go from this top edge to the vertical side here. This is a really tricky one because if your knife is too flat as you try and do this chamfer, you're essentially cutting uphill and you're going to chip the wood and ruin your spoon. So you need to tilt the spoon like this and do your chamfer that way. And that way you're actually going downhill like that. Can you see that? Whereas if the knife is too much like this, you're actually going uphill. So it's a tricky thing. It's going downhill in this orientation. It's going uphill in this orientation. So if it's tilted like this, you can get away with it. If it's too much like this, you're going to ruin your spoon. So it's a delicate thing. So I usually hold it on its side like this, start at the widest point. And again, I'm just trying to take the thinnest little shaving that I can. Here I have a little spot at the tip that's a little rougher, so I'm going to widen that chamfer up just to get underneath those rougher bits. And then do the other side, and again I'm holding it tilted on its side so that I do the micro chamfer in an orientation where it's not going to split the wood, but instead is going to be willing to go around the wood like that. Well, this is exactly why I do this, is that I think it really helps. Once you can articulate what's going on and what to do about it, I think you'll be able to do it no problem. All right, so now I'm coming, same deal. The grain is now going up in this direction here, so you can't have your knife be like this. It has to be tilted on its side. But I'm doing that extension of that same micro chamfer. Another way to think of it is if you want to hold the spoon like, you can either hold the spoon like this and have your knife be horizontal, or hold the spoon horizontal and have your knife be, 45 degrees. Either of those situations will work out well. What you can't do is have your knife be parallel to the spoon like this. That won't work. Okay, so now I've got micro chamfers on the outside. I've got the outline exactly how I want. Now it's time to thin out the bowl of the spoon. And here's where I use my fingers as calipers, and I kind of get a sense of, okay, how thick is it? And what I'm shooting for is it to be thickest right here in the middle, here, and then I want it to taper as it goes to the rim. Now you can see that rim is quite thick there, so I need to keep that in mind, that it actually, when I'm making this cut, I need to be sort of have some extra oomph at the end in order to bust my way through that thicker tip. So here's where essentially do hand squeeze cuts, and I'm going to back it off a little bit so you guys can see everything above the comments. So hand squeeze cuts, and then right there, I keep going, and I get it so that it pushes through that thick rim there and goes all the way to the tip. Now I go one step over, do the same thing. And then I go one step over, and I do the same thing. Now, rather than work my way all the way to the rim like that, I do this little bit at the rim first so that I can stay away from it. It's okay to approach the rim at the tip this way. You tend not to overshoot it, but it is easy to bust through the sides and make the rim too thin on the side. So I do the rim first, and then I do this last one that was in between what I just did and the one before that. So you see how that's given me a nice even curve there. So now I'm going to walk my way over from the other side. Same deal. And if I can't make the full length of the spoon, that's fine. I'm going to look at the tip and try and make sure that I'm pushing down far enough to get the tip even. And I'm feeling with my fingers to feel how much I think I can take off. This again is where you don't necessarily get points for taking off a lot all in one go. These are finishing cuts. They can be delicate cuts. Here I am adjusting the side independently and then blending it in with that side there. Okay. So that's pretty good, but I still have a little too much material here at the tip. So rather than make those cuts all over again, I'm just going to do a series of overlapping cuts here at the tip to get the weight exactly how I want it. So it tapers just so. And it's those overlapping cuts that blend the whole thing in. You can't do just one cut, you got to do a series of cuts. Okay, good. In my mouth, okay, I got the taper just right now. So that's good. Do I have the weight just right? I could go a little bit thinner, but before I do that, I want to figure out what I'm going to be doing on these back shoulders. These back shoulders can be tricky for people because there's a grain change. You can't just come in here on the side because you're actually going to split into the grain, right? Because I'm trying to dive into the wood that's there. So there's usually this sort of almost like a whale's tail of sort of grain that needs to be cut in the other direction. And how much I let that be is sort of a stylized whale's tail and how much I just essentially fold it over has a lot to do with what I think of the spoon and whether it sort of seems to have happened naturally, whether the neck is really thin or not. In general, I only go with the stylized, sort of whale's tail being very defined if I think it's sort of already naturally happening on its own and if the wood is very well behaved. Otherwise, I go with more free-form facets that are easier to adjust. And I usually start at the rim itself. And you have to be careful because one side you're actually sort of pivoting on the tip and cutting with the back of the blade, and this other side you're pivoting on the back of the blade and cutting with the tip. They're actually two different cuts, and you're sort of always going to pull towards the side where you're cutting with the back of the blade, the side that's closer to your knife hand. So you need to be aware that that's happening and sort of deliberately push it over to keep that spine of that keel lined up and even. Because otherwise, if you just sort of do equal cuts on either side, you're not taking into account the fact that you're doing two different cuts and they're not going to be equal in how much wood they take off at each point of the cut, and you're going to end up with a lopsided keel. Okay, so now I am blending and blending. There's usually more material back here on the shoulders that can be removed than we realize. I have almost never seen a spoon that's been overcut on these back shoulders. So just keep that in mind and don't be afraid to spend a little more time back there. Now, because of how careful I'm being, I am actually rather getting a bit of a whale's tail. So maybe I will exaggerate it and just have it be exactly that. Notice how at the tip of the fluke here, I need to go in the other direction. And I can tell that because that last cut was doing a little bit of tear out right at the edge there. And so that tells me that the grain has changed. I need to make sure I'm blending this top line here and blending it down into the handle. This is where those loose facets really come into their own, in that you can blend anything to anything else, and just by doing a series of loose facets, you can make it look as though it was fully intended to be that way from the beginning. And here we go. Good. And you sort of adjust the line. If you're doing a whale's tail, you sort of adjust the line both going in this direction and going in the other direction. It doesn't just happen from one direction. It happens from the combination of cuts you make from both directions. Okay, good, good. That's feeling pretty good. That's feeling pretty good. A little more to remove right here. And you want to be careful not to overcut the rim, particularly on this side where you're not using the tip, but you're actually using just down from the tip, because you can't actually see the line you're cutting, so it's easy to overcut it. Whereas on this side where you can see the tip, it sort of emerges real quick from underneath the tip, and you can make adjustments more easily. Okay? That's a really nice spoon. So now the last cut I make is a little micro chamfer that knocks off the sharp connection from the bottom of the bowl up to that 90-degree face around the edge. So it's this little tiny cut here. And again, it goes from the widest part up to the tip. And because it's going with the grain more strongly than on the top, you have to worry about it less. It's not going to tear out in the same way that the top one is if you don't get the angle quite right. So it's just less finicky that way. Don't forget the back shoulders. I used to always forget to do the micro chamfer back here in the early days. And there we have it. So there is the finished eating spoon. Nice strong keel. Really almost no flex. A little bit of flex is nice though, I have to say. This one has a little bit of flex and it makes all the difference. So now, bear with me, I just gotta get the burnisher and polisher. Move the camera. And then we're going to burnish and polish. Since I have them, because I pulled them out for the gathering, let's talk about burnishing for a second. So burnishing is just rubbing your spoon with something that's harder than the wood that you use. The very first thing I used was this pebble. And it's fairly simple. It has to be a smooth pebble. If it marks the wood, it's no good. But there's a lot of beaches where these pebbles this smooth, or rivers where pebbles this smooth can be found. And it works really nicely. Again, if it starts marking the wood, stop immediately. The one thing that pebbles don't do particularly well is the outside of the handle. They do the bowls amazingly well. They're so good at doing the bowls. And the stone is really nice. They don't do a great job on the outside because they're totally rounded. So they sort of only hit one spot at a time. Now sometimes you get lucky and you have a pebble that has a bit of a flat area, and that can be nice. So from there, I said, well, let's see if I can use this deer antler that I had. So I had a deer antler, and I cut off the antler from a section, trying to keep a bigger section to do the bowls. And I sanded the thing all over with the same sandpaper I used to sharpen the knives. And you can see I didn't remove all the ridges, but I made it so that the whole thing is smooth. There's no sharpness to it. And I took it all the way up to probably to 3000 grit. This now has a part in the middle that I can do the bowl like that. That's quite nice. And it has this lovely section here for doing the handles like that. For a while I was like messing around with deer antlers that you can get in dog food stores, pet stores, as dog chew toys. But you gotta a lot of the ones are too big, too fat. To get one that's nice and delicate like this is difficult. So then I was messing around with a pestle like this, because I felt like this part wasn't doing as good a job as the rock. And I had this pestle, and I thought, well, that's quite nice. So I tried that, and that's great, particularly for big spoons. Having this large rounded bit just makes it a much smoother surface on the inside of the bowl. But unfortunately, this glazed portion doesn't do a particularly good job. I think because it's glazed, it just doesn't have quite the It doesn't have the same effect. So that's where mashing those two together is where I got the porcelain burnishers that I have Adam Reynolds make, which combines the deer antler and the burnisher. But you can see that there are all sorts of other options. You can use a piece of tropical hardwood that you sand until it's really smooth, but it's harder than the wood you're using. Each material kind of has its own thing going on. Now, how much you burnish is just a matter of personal preference. If you burnish way more, you will end up with a spoon that's much softer and has lost many of its facets. So for me, there's sort of a middle ground where I do it a little bit, but not a ton. That's also because I'm impatient. Now, notice that I'm doing this before I do the treatment. I want to go a little beyond what I want it to be, because when I do the oil treatment and the heat treatment, the facets will kind of pop out a little bit again. So I want to go a little bit beyond what I want, because anticipating that it will sort of become slightly more angular. So again, I'm supporting the spoon against my leg as I do it. Yada, yada, yada. Now, this will help you get a smooth surface. It is not going to help you as much as having a really sharp knife. And if your spoon is too wet to do your finishing cuts and get a clean surface, this is also not necessarily going to help you. That being said, you can use this burnishing process on a spoon that is already done, has been in your kitchen for a long time. You can burnish all sorts of stuff and really sort of get spoons to a state that they might not have already had. So if you have spoons kicking around, try burnishing them and see if it improves them. You'll notice that I'm paying attention to burnish all of the edges. It doesn't work to burnish edges if you haven't taken a micro chamfer off of them. You need that slight angle, otherwise you end up compressing the sharp point that was there, and it actually can make it less smooth because it'll sort of fold the point over to one side or the other. So you gotta do the micro chamfers on the rim for it to work out well. One of the things I love most about burnishing is how it can take these pommels on my handles, and I actually use quite a bit of pressure with this, and it can make it just as though I took sandpaper to it, except it takes a fraction of the time. And you can still see a little bit of the facets, but it just makes these beautifully smooth, rounded pommels that I've been really digging. Just like that, right? Okay, so then the next phase in finishing for me is using this Broomcorn polisher. You could just take a side of your broom and just see if you like it. But really the principle is that the Broomcorn is a nice polishing agent, and because it has a little bit of flex, not a lot, it's quite hard, but because it has a little bit of flex, it's going to wrap around the facets in a way that the porcelain is never going to wrap around the facets. And notice that I'm using the side. I'm not trying to use this bristly bit here at the end. I'm using the side, and it won't do in the bowl of the spoon, but boy, it really adds a certain sheen to the entire surface of the spoon that it doesn't have if you just use a burnisher by itself, which is why I call this a polisher, not a burnisher. So, just like that. Voila. Now, I might be running out of time, but let's talk about finishes for a second. I use a 2-to-1 ratio of jojoba oil and beeswax. I have a coffee can. I mix it up in the coffee can, roughly by eye. I don't weigh it or anything. And I heat it up. I give it a stir. You want to make sure you don't overfill the coffee can, because the whole thing expands a little bit as it warms up. And then I give it a stir and I turn it off, let it cool, sort of mash it up, and then mash it into this tin. That way the wax structure is broken up and it's easy to grab a fingerful like this. So I used to use linseed oil and other hardening oils, and I both hated how they tasted. My customers hated how they tasted, and I didn't like how they turned the wood quite a yellow color over time. Guys, I have 30 seconds remaining, so I'm just going to describe the process. I take this, I smear it on, and then I hold it over a stove burner, and I keep turning it, and I smear the extra on where it's dried out until the whole thing is quite hot. And I keep smearing it around, And then I take a cloth, an old t-shirt, and I wipe it down, and then the spoon is good to go. So that's it. Thanks for watching. 3, 2, 1.